I'm also going to show you a little bit about creating normal maps using Photoshop, because there are some limited things you can do using just Photoshop to build your normal maps. So for instance, if you're building environments, you don't need to, say for instance you want a door or a window frame, something like that, something very simple. You don't need to actually build all that geometry in your 3D Studio Max scene and go through all the trouble of generating a normal map for something simple like that. What we can do is just come into Photoshop. I'm going to create a new image. Just make this 512 by 512. And I'm just going to use some of the painting tools and selection tools. So I'm just going to make a couple of quick selections. I'm just going to draw kind of a box here very quickly. I'm not really doing this very accurately, but you guys should get the point of this. So I've got my kind of window frame there. I'm going to grab this and set it to black. Edit, fill. Fill that in. And then I'm going to go ahead and select the interior of that and do a little blur on it. Just turn up the value of that. So basically what I'm trying to get is a hard edge that kind of blends out to a soft edge on the inside. So I've got this little thing here. So basically what I'm going to do is build a normal map off of this right here. First thing I'm going to do is just invert the image, because it's going to treat white as positive value and black as negative. So it's going to basically build the normal map as if the white is being displaced outward. We'll come up here into the NVIDIA Tools plugin. And you can see when I select average RGB, you can see the normal map, how it's actually generating that right there. I can also scale that up a little bit so we get a deeper normal map. And you can see here's the normal map that it basically just rendered for me. So by basically just using a simple grayscale pattern, you can come into Photoshop and do some fairly quick, simple hacks and fakes. For instance, if you want to do bricks or some simple environment textures, things for window frames or door frames, it's very easy to come into Photoshop and quickly just kind of paint it out and generate a normal map for it. Now, for doing complex things, for instance that demon, you just don't really have enough control within Photoshop to see what you're going to get, to see what the end result is. So I highly recommend you guys go check out some of the tools that are on the floor, and specifically I'm talking about the Sensible's Clay Tools modeling system, which is going to allow you to model incredibly high detailed surfaces, and it actually generates true 3D geometry in the process of that. So, and they've actually, the Sensible guys have actually added the ability to render out normal maps, ambient occlusion maps, and height maps right out of Clay Tools. So you don't need to try and take this 10 million poly, 20 million poly object out of Clay Tools and get it into Max. You can actually use their tools at this point to start handling some of the more complex things. So again, I'm just going to take this ambient occlusion map that was rendered for the demon, and I'm just going to open up the NVIDIA tools and just see what happens when I run this on here. I'm going to scale this up to like 8 so you can really see. You can kind of see the difference there. See what that normal map looks like. So occasionally you can get away with, just taking your diffuse color on certain simple objects, or for environment objects, coming into Photoshop and just doing them right in here. For some of the more complex things, you're going to want more control over how those edges blend across. If you want some complex fillets and chamfers flowing across your door frame, then you probably want to model that kind of detail and just use the projection system to project your normal map. So that's basically all of the material that I've got on normal mapping. Do you guys have any questions? Is there anything that I can answer for you? Yeah, if you're just using it at render time, you can put the ambient occlusion map in the self-illumination channel of the material. Let's see if we can get that to work. I'm just kind of flying off the cuff here, so I'm not really sure if I can get this to work or not. Let's just create a box and a sphere and maybe a plane. And come into our material editor. First, we're going to need to switch over to Mental Ray. Now I'm going to make a material with self-illumination. I'm going to add the ambient occlusion in there. Just assign that to all these objects. Let's hit render and see what happens. So you can see that I'm getting ambient occlusion on these objects right here. Now if I were to add a color into the diffuse map, let's close that. Just add a bitmap. See if we've got any images here. Down in the maps folder. I think that'll work just fine. Let's just render that again. What happens when we do it from this angle? So you can see that I'm getting ambient occlusion. You can see the occlusion happening from the sphere onto the box right here, and the occlusion happening from the plane up onto the box and the sphere right here. So that's basically how you would go about getting ambient occlusion to work. Now, exactly. Now, what I would do is just use the render to texture utility to bake out the lighting of that ambient occlusion map. If you're doing a static scene. So we can take this sphere now. Let's see what we can do here. Got a diffuse map. I'm going to turn on lighting and shadows. Actually, just shadows. Where did I render that to? Let's go check my path. Come up here to master class, Mike Brown. What do we have here? Sphere diffuse. Turn on lighting and render that again. So I know that there is a way. For the life of me, sorry about that. For the life of me, I've been rendering ambient occlusion maps for the last 4 or 5 months, and for the life of me this week I've been demoing for so many other companies that I just can't wrap my brain around what I'm forgetting right now. So I apologize for that. I know that there is a very simple way, and I can put together a sample file and post that on my website so that you guys can have a look at that. It's www.antics, A-N-T-I-C as in cat, Z as in zebra.com. So, yes? What's that? Oh, yeah. Let's go ahead and open up that daemon again. So we're going to come into master class. Okay, so basically, I've got this daemon that I'm using a DX9 shader on to show you guys the normal map. So what I'm going to do is just come into that material right here. I'm going to show you that down here I've set up my DX9 shader, and I'm using the occlusion map right there in a white texture. Oh. And for the bump, I'm using the normal map. And that's basically that's the DX9 shader. Now if I disable that and say DX display of standard material, you can see that it also takes advantage of my normal map. So if I come up here, if you want to use your normal map for render time in 3D Studio Max, it's very simple. You come to the bump channel, click on that. Actually, let's just make a new one so you can see. If you come down to the bump channel, you select that, and you'll see a map type in here called normal bump. I'm just going to hit OK. And now basically what this gives me the option of doing is adding a normal map and a bump map on top of that. So you can kind of layer the two together. So if you want to put a little bit of noise onto the whatever it is that you have normal mapped, you can go ahead and add some noise in there and then use the render to texture again to collapse that together for the game engine. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose a bitmap, go and find my normal map. So there's my normal map. Open that up, and you can see that it's displaying that right in the base shader. Just going to assign that to the model right there. Go up a level. I could also add a bitmap to use as bump, but I'm not going to do that just right now. And I think I've copied all of these shaders around in the material editor, so I'm just going to disable that so you can see that all I'm using is the render. And let's turn on show safe frame. And just zoom in a bit and render this out using the standard scanline renderer. So you can see the Max scanline renderer takes full advantage of using normal maps at render time. You can also use Brazil to render out normal maps at render time. I'm not really sure, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head if Mental Ray will support the normal bump map in the material. But that's basically how you would go about using a normal map on a surface. I'm also going to show you another thing that's kind of cool. We magnify that. I'm going to come up here to my normal bump map right here, and I can actually increase the amount of that bump. So I can multiply that so you can see that it's much bumpier surface now. So if we hit render again, you can see that we've increased that level of bump in there. Or conversely, again, I can take that and decrease it. So we're getting just a little bit of that bump in there. Hit render again. You can see that we're still picking up that normal map. So, very good way of using the normal bump to generate detail, and you can really, you've got some leg room to kind of tune it a little bit in the shader. So now if I wanted to layer together, say I want to take a normal map and layer it together with a bitmap or another procedural material, what I could do is I'm just going to set that back to 1, and then I'm going to add another bitmap. Just going to come out here and find a map. Come into brick and see what we've got. This will work just fine right here. And so now you can see those two are kind of layered together. If I hit render, you can see that brick pattern in there just a little bit, just to kind of augment that. So if I were to add a little bit of noise or something into the surface using a bitmap or using a procedural material, I could layer those two effects together. Any other questions? Right there.
Okay, so does the normal map have any effect on the object's edges when you like zoom in really close? It doesn't actually, you'll see the low poly cave basically, right?
So the question is, does the normal map actually have any effect on the object's edges? And the answer to that question is no. All the normal map is, it's basically if you think of it like a bump map on steroids. So instead of just having, for instance, a bump map is just a grayscale image. So the only kind of data that you're getting out of that is how far out from the surface am I going to put this. What a normal map basically tells you is what direction am I facing in as well. So essentially, you can see you're not only calculating in Z, but you're also calculating in X and Y along the tangent to the surface, if that makes sense. So the short answer is no. The normal map will not increase the edge. It basically won't add any polygons to your surface. If you want to see something like that, what you'll need to do is render out a height map, which I showed a little bit of with the tiling example. So you render out the height map and then use mental ray's displacement feature and use that height map to do the micro poly subdivision displacement at render time. And then what you'll see is the silhouette will actually change because it's subdividing the surface at a micro poly level and then pushing it outward. Brazil 2, which should be releasing. You have to talk to the Splutterfish guys, but they've been showing a lot of it at SIGGRAPH, and they've got some really cool stuff in there. I don't know what their exact timetable is for release, but it should be fairly soon.
Okay, and how much of a hit does that take on render time?
That's a good question. The question was, how much of a hit does it take to use a displacement map at render time using mental ray or Brazil? And the answer to that is very little. The beauty thing about using a displacement map, using mental ray or RenderMen or Brazil 2, is that you get all of the advantages of having a really high detail surface without any of the penalties, right? So if you were to take a 40 million poly surface, say, or a 10 million poly surface that's got all this detail in it, and you were to drop that into your scene and render it, you might see a fairly long render time. If you were to take that same thing and generate a displacement map off of that, and then use mental ray or Brazil or RenderMen, for instance, to render out that micro poly subdivision displacement at render time, you'll see very little impact on the render time. So essentially, you're generating a what's the word I'm looking for? You're kind of generating a surface on the fly at render time, and the renderer handles all of the subdivision and all of that, and it's basically just doing a per pixel sample. So instead of having to hold 40 million polygons in memory it can basically sample that pixel and find out where that geometry at the pixel has been displaced to. So it's very fast.
So basically, you use the height map that you render out as that map for the displacement.
Exactly. So the question was, you'd basically use the height map to do see the edge change around the surface at render time. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about using height maps. Unfortunately, I don't have any examples prepared for you guys, but here's kind of the trick to it. When you generate your height maps, you're going to want to render those out at the same resolution that you have your mesh subdivided to. So for instance, if you use the projection system in Max, and you have a 4500 poly object, and you render out your height map, you don't want to then put a mesh smooth on that surface and use the same height map that you would have used with the 4500 poly surface. Because what you'll see is, you generate this height map that's very kind of, you'll see the facets of the 4500 poly model, right? And those are kind of gonna offset things to make it smooth. So what you'll want to do is mesh smooth that, render your height map at the mesh smooth level, then go back, set up your low poly guy, put on the mesh smooth for render time, and then use that micro poly displacement at the same level of detail. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
Where does the ambient occlusion, where do you put it at on the material editor?
That's a good question. The question is, where do you put the ambient occlusion map in the material editor? And the answer is, it depends on what you're trying to do with it. So if you're using it for render time, you're going to put it into the self-illumination channel and use that to render. So for instance, if you want to render out an ambient occlusion pass on a very large scene and use that for compositing, you could make your material full bright white. So let's just go ahead and set that up. Make that full bright white. And then in the self-illumination, put on your, actually we need to switch our renderer over to mental ray before we can do that. So then in the self-illumination, we're going to put on the ambient occlusion reflective base. And then we could render this view of a very large scene and use that render as a composite to kind of layer in our ambient occlusion.